Hey everyone, this is a chapter from a biography uh, of Trotsky by Geoffrey Swain. Um, this chapter is about the Bolshevik Revolution, October 1917, and the early days um, of it. Um, I'm reading this just to brush up on some of my knowledge about Trotsky's involvement in the October Revolution and the left opposition in the 1920s. So here we go. Trotsky arrived in Petrograd on the 4th of May 1917, and as soon as he had found some lodgings for his family, he set off for the Smolny Institute, the former Young Ladies' Academy whose buildings had been allocated to the Petrograd Soviet. For Trotsky, the prospects for the revolution were quite straightforward. Workers should take up where they had left off in 1905 and use the power they exercised via the Soviet to establish a working-class government. As Trotsky understood it, during February it had been the workers who had ensured the success of the revolution by seizing control of the post and telegraph services, the wireless office, all the railway stations, and the printing works, and if they were prepared to act in this way again, political power could be theirs. Trotsky was therefore delighted to discover that Lenin too favored the principle of the Soviet taking power, and had abandoned the hesitations on the matter which had marred cooperation in 1905. New section, joining the Bolsheviks. Trotsky's late arrival in Petrograd meant he had a poor understanding of events within the Bolshevik Party during March and April 1917, when the issue of Soviet power had first been raised. When the Tsar was overthrown, the first Bolsheviks to emerge from the underground to establish a temporary bureau of the Central Committee opposed the provisional government being established by the liberals and demanded, quote, a revolutionary provisional government, end quote. When Kamenev and Stalin returned from exile in Siberia in mid-March, they pulled the Central Committee away from this radical stance and called for a dual strategy of close supervision of the provisional government combined with moves gradually to develop the Petrograd Soviet into, quote, the beginnings of a revolutionary power, end quote. When Lenin returned to Petrograd on the 3rd of April, Lenin condemned this caution and called for Bolsheviks to campaign for a Soviet government. However, events soon convinced Lenin that it was premature to launch such a program. In mid-April, the provisional government and the Soviet clashed over the liberal foreign minister's determination to continue pursuing the war aims of the Tsar. Soviet protest demonstrations were called, and the Bolshevik Petrograd Committee, echoing Lenin's radicalism, issued leaflets calling for the overthrow of the provisional government and the immediate establishment of Soviet power. The key figure in producing this leaflet was Bogatiev. 1 second. Sorry. You're not seeing anything for Bagdatiev. The key figure in producing this leaflet was Bagdatiev, who had played such a prominent role in the campaign against the War Industries Committee. On the 24th of April, during the 17th Party Conference, Lenin condemned the launching of this slogan at the present time as, quote, adventurous. Quote, we cannot now overthrow the government, end quote, Lenin stressed. Thus, just as Stalin had moved to discipline those Bolsheviks keen to seize power in March, so Lenin too criticized those calling for insurrection in April. Oh shit, gotta find the endnotes. Shit. Sorry, I know this is annoying. Okay, footnote, Rabinowitz, Prelude to Revolution. Okay, so the description for Prelude to Revolution, the Petrograd Bolsheviks and the July 1917 Uprising by Alexander Rabinowitz, its description says, first published in 1968, this pioneering study of the revolutionary events in Petrograd in the summer of 1917 revised the established view of the Bolsheviks as a monolithic party. Rabinowitz documented how the party's pluralistic nature had crucial implications for the outcome of the revolution in October. And its contents are Chapter 1, the historical background, 2, the struggle begins, 3, the abortive June 10th demonstration, 4, the rise of unrest, 5, the July uprising begins, 6, the July uprising culmination and collapse, 7, the July uprising retreat and reaction, Chapter 8, conclusion, the party divided. Back to the text. On his arrival, Trotsky's reception at Smolny was rather lukewarm. After the initial confusion of the Tsar's overthrow, the leadership of the Soviet had fallen into the hands of pro-war Mensheviks. These were the political associates of the two organizations which had had a legal existence during the First World War, the non-Bolshevik deputies to the Fourth Duma, and those pro-war Mensheviks who, despite their clear vote of the factories in 1915 not to establish a workers' group within the War Industries Committee, had nonetheless gone ahead and established just such a group. These leaders of the larger labor movement, these leaders of the legal labor movement, are used to cooperating with the liberals and SRs represented in the Duma, had almost inevitably come to dominate the Soviet in its first weeks of existence. At the moment Trotsky arrived, far from urging the Soviet to seize power, its leaders were negotiating with the liberals about forming a coalition government. Because of his role in 1905, Trotsky was given a non-voting seat on the Soviet executive, but his views were completely out of tune with the Soviet leadership. Thus, on the 5th of May, Trotsky's first political act of 1917 was to join with the Bolsheviks and vote in the Soviet against the formation of a coalition government. His message was simple: do not trust the bourgeoisie, control your own leaders, and rely on your own force. The stance did not go down well. To quote his own History of the Russian Revolution, quote, he left the hall amid far less applause than had greeted his entrance, end quote. And for the next few weeks, Trotsky showed little interest in attending Soviet executive meetings. As Trotsky stressed in his memoirs, Trotsky argued his case for revolution, quote, on the basis of my own premises and on my own revolutionary experience, end quote. But Trotsky was now proposing, quote, the same line of strategy as Lenin, end quote. And that caused Trotsky to reassess his relationship with the Bolshevik leader. Joint activity was clearly essential to rally opposition to the established Soviet leadership. Trotsky immediately reestablished contact with the interdistrict group, which had survived the wartime persecution more or less intact and retained a good following in the factories, and urged them to consider uniting with the Bolsheviks. Footnote: see Trotsky, The History of the Russian Revolution, N. Sukhanov, The Russian Revolution, A Personal Record, and Trotsky, My Life. End footnote. Talks between the interdistrict group and the Bolsheviks about a possible merger began almost at once. On the 7th of May, the two organizations hosted a joint meeting to mark Trotsky's return, and the talks proper began on the 10th. Trotsky found himself face-to-face with his old protagonists, Lenin and Kamenev, joined now by Lenin's closest associate from the years of emigration, Grigory Zinoviev. Trotsky was wrong-footed by Lenin's determination to be conciliatory. Lenin had wanted to make Trotsky editor of Pravda, but his Central Committee colleagues would not agree. Nevertheless, Trotsky and Trotsky supporters were offered seats on the paper's editorial board as well as on the Central Committee. The talks stalled because of fears that, despite Lenin's apparent generosity, the interdistrict group was being taken over rather than offered a genuine merger. Trotsky was keen that the new merged organization should have a new name rather than inheriting the Bolshevik title, and Trotsky had to consider the views of those rank-and-file interdistrict group activists who felt that there was no evidence to show that the Bolshevik faction was now truly democratic and had abandoned the old sectarian practices of the Bolshevik committees. Footnote: see Isaac Deutscher, The Prophet Armed, Trotsky, 1879 to 1921, and the edited volume, Leon Trotsky, The Challenge of the Left Opposition, 1923 to 25. End footnote. Some of the interdistrict group leaders, notably Anatoly Lunacharsky, felt that the discussions with the Bolsheviks should be put on hold. Anatoly Lunacharsky believed that the interdistrict group should associate itself with the left-wing Menshevik newspaper New Life. Wikipedia says Novaya Zhin, which translates as New Life, was a daily newspaper published by a group of Mensheviks associated with the literary magazine Letopis, including Nikolai Sukhanov, Vladimir Bazarov, Stroev, Denitsky, A.N. Tikhonov. It was published in Petrograd from the 18th of April, 1st of May, 1917, until the 16th of July, 1918, with a total of 354 issues, and then in Moscow from June to July 1918, when it was closed down. The most known contributor was Maxim Gorky. The Swedish correspondent of the newspaper was Paul Olberg. It was interrupted in September 1917 when publication was suspended on the orders of the Russian Provisional Government. Before the October Revolution, the Bolshevik leaders Zinoviev and Kamenev published their opposition in this newspaper, leaking the news and jeopardizing the coup d'etat. This move was later used against them by Stalin. It should not be confused with the Bolsheviks' paper, Novaya Zhin, which was published for 2 months in 1905. Back to the text. Trotsky believed that the interdistrict group should associate itself with the left-wing Menshevik newspaper New Life, which was critical of the formation by the Soviet of the coalition government, but without going so far as calling for its replacement by a Soviet government. For Trotsky, the issue of a workers' government was fundamental. On the 25th of May, Trotsky attended a formal meeting of New Life's editorial board, but when it became clear that the editors would not support the calls for a Soviet government, Trotsky stated, quote, "It remains for me and Lenin to make our own newspaper," end quote. At which point any lingering association with the Mensheviks on Trotsky's part ended. And yet the merger talks with the Bolsheviks remained stalled. Lunacharsky's opposition to the merger was supported by others, and so the interdistrict group put the interdistrict group's editorial energies into establishing a short-lived newspaper, Forward. Footnote: Sukhanov, Russian Revolution, and Trotsky, History of the Russian Revolution. End footnote. Trotsky had always argued that Bolshevik sectarianism was a product of the backwardness of the Russian working class movement and would be outlived only by practical activity within the grassroots. Events of May-June 1917 seemed to bear this out. For increasingly over these weeks, whatever issues still divided them, the interdistrict group and the Bolsheviks cooperated closely in coordinating their opposition to the coalition government with its policy of supporting the war. On the 13th of May, the Soviet at the naval base in Kronstadt clashed with the provisional government. The issue at stake was the power that should be exercised by the Commissar, appointed by the provisional government to oversee the naval base and its level of support for the forthcoming military offensive. The fiercely anti-war Kronstadt sailors, the man appointed as Commissar, a liberal, had counter-revolutionary connections, and so they rebelled through their Soviet, which declared itself sovereign and arrested both the Commissar and several unpopular officers. The coalition government asked the Petrograd Soviet to intervene and help resolve the crisis by arranging for the arrested Commissar to be released. Their intervention failed and in fact made things worse when the Soviet leaders tried to put the representatives of the Kronstadt Soviet on trial. Trotsky took up their defense while at the same time underlining the powerlessness of the Soviet leadership by successfully arranging himself for those who had been detained in Kronstadt to be released. This combination of advocacy and diplomacy was backed up by a steady round of public meetings addressed by Trotsky, Lunacharsky, and the Bolshevik agitators. When the first Congress of Soviets assembled at the start of June, cooperation between the inter-district group and the Bolsheviks became even closer. On the 4th of June, the Bolshevik faction of the Congress read out a statement on the provisional government's planned military offensive, which had been written by Trotsky. When called upon to speak, he took the same line as Lenin, predicting that the offensive would end in disaster and urging the Soviet to establish its own government able and willing to spread revolution to Europe. Quote, "The Russian Revolutionary Army and Russian democracy will find allies in Europe, ... If Germany does not rise, or if Germany rises too feebly, then we shall move our regiments, not in order to defend ourselves, but in order to undertake a revolutionary offensive." End quote. As the Congress proceeded, so did the level of inter-district group Bolshevik cooperation. Although Lenin faced opposition from within his Central Committee, and Trotsky faced opposition from Anatoly Lunacharsky and more cautious colleagues, the two organizations agreed to organize a massive demonstration on the 10th of June under the slogan, quote, "Down with the 10 capitalist ministers," end quote. The provisional government banned the demonstration, but both organizations accepted that they had no choice but to cancel the action, but had to explain this to their supporters without losing face. Lenin drafted a statement, but was unhappy with the statement, as were other Bolshevik leaders. Trotsky, who had delivered a similar speech in 1905, submitted a draft which the Bolsheviks accepted and was read out in the name of the whole opposition. Footnote, Deutscher, the Prophet Armed. Very little now separated Lenin and Trotsky, but nuances could be detected. During the first Congress of Soviets, stung by a Menshevik challenge that there was no socialist party ready to take power into its own hands, Lenin had asserted that there was, and it was the Bolsheviks. Trotsky's emphasis was different. Trotsky referred to a Soviet government with the implication both that it might have a non-Bolshevik composition and, given the then composition of the Soviet, the formation of such a government was some way off. Such differences would be important for the future, but the rank and file of the inter-district group were already calling for the merger with the Bolsheviks to be speeded up. On the 2nd of July, a special conference of the inter-district group took place, and the result was a foregone conclusion. Trotsky still faced some opposition from leading figures within the organization, but decided to preempt them by publishing a statement in Pravda to the effect that, quote, "There are, in my opinion, at the present time, no differences either in principle or tactics between the inter-district and Bolshevik organizations. Accordingly, there are no motives which justify the separate existence of these organizations," end quote. Footnote. See Sukhanov, Russian Revolution, and Trotsky, History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2, end footnote. And that quote was from Trotsky as well, if that wasn't clear. New section, the July days. even though we're going to learn about the July days, just looking up the Wikipedia for the July days really quickly. The July days were a period of unrest in Petrograd, Russia between the 16th and 20th of July, 1917. The July days were characterized by spontaneous armed demonstrations by soldiers, sailors, and industrial workers engaged against the Russian provisional government. The demonstrations were angrier and more violent than those during the February Revolution months earlier. The provisional government blamed the Bolsheviks for the violence brought about by the July days, and in a subsequent crackdown on the Bolshevik Party, the party was dispersed, many of the leadership arrested. Vladimir Lenin led to Finland, while Leon Trotsky was among those arrested. The outcome of the July days represented a temporary decline in the girth of Bolshevik power and influence in the period before the October Revolution. Back to the text. The official merger of the two organizations would take place only in late July at the Six-Party Congress. However, collaboration continued at once since the two organizations adopted the same stance in the crisis known as the July Days. As Trotsky had predicted, the provisional government's June offensive had been a disaster. Preparations for the offensive had been the one thing that had kept the unstable coalition government together, and as the coalition government faltered, the liberal ministers decided to bring down the government by resigning, taking as their pretext the latest disagreement about whether or not to allow a limited degree of regional autonomy to Ukraine. In the absence of a secure government, Trotsky and the Bolsheviks resolved to organize mass demonstrations under the slogan, "All power to the Soviets." Although in the Petrograd Soviet as a whole, the Bolsheviks were still in a minority, the Soviet had both workers' and soldiers' sections, and in the workers' section, Trotsky and the Bolsheviks had a clear majority by July. The workers' section thus supported the idea of a demonstration by endorsing a resolution proposed by Kamenev and seconded by Trotsky. The demonstrators would lobby the meetings of the Soviet executive called to decide how the Soviet should respond to the collapse of the coalition government. The meeting of the Soviet executive was to take place at the Tauride Palace. Wikipedia says Tauride Palace is one of the largest and most historically important places in St. Petersburg, Russia. Back to the text. The idea, once proposed, rapidly got out of hand. Crowds rallied outside as in the early hours of the 4th of July, the Soviet executive held preliminary discussions resolving that any decision taken should be binding on all members, something which prompted Trotsky and his supporters to walk out. Many workers wanted to protest with Trotsky at the way the Soviet executive planned to force through a decision in favor of forming a second coalition government, but this anger soon intermingled with a separate but related issue. Throughout the June military offensive, the 1st Machine Gun Regiment stationed in Petrograd had resisted orders that its units be sent to the front. By the end of June, rumors were rife that the whole regiment would either be sent to the front or disbanded. The activists were determined to rebel rather than suffer their fate. Some offered the Bolshevik military organization enough machine guns to seize power, but the Central Committee stamped on such wild schemes. However, the Bolshevik military organization did start to encourage the machine gunners to take part in the planned demonstration, and by the evening of the 3rd of July, some had begun to take control of strategic positions in the capital. Trotsky only learned of the machine gun regiment joining the demonstration on the evening of the 3rd of July. The news took Trotsky by surprise, particularly when it became clear that the Kronstadt sailors were also determined to join it. When the Bolsheviks and the interdistrict group met before dawn on the 4th of July, they had to decide whether to try and cancel the demonstration, which seemed to be getting out of hand, or stand at its head and try to keep it within bounds. They opted for the latter, and Trotsky, on the telephone to the Kronstadt sailors, appealed to them to attend the demonstration unarmed. The Kronstadt sailors landed at about 10 in the morning and marched straight to the Bolshevik headquarters at the Kishizinskaya mansion. Lenin addressed them from the balcony before handing over to Lunacharsky, who was a much better orator. Their message was the same, however. Despite the revolutionary rhetoric, there was no call on the sailors to seize power. Instead, Lunacharsky led the demonstrators to the city center, where he linked up with workers who had marched in from the industrial suburbs. The angry demonstrators were then marched along the main thoroughfare, Nevsky Prospect, onto the Field of Mars. Wikipedia says Nevsky Prospect is a main street, high street located in the federal city of St. Petersburg in Russia. Nevsky Prospect's name comes from the Alexander Nevsky Lavra, the monastery which stands at the eastern end of the street and which commemorates the Russian hero Prince Saint Alexander Nevsky, who lived from 1221 to 1263. Following his founding of St. Petersburg in 1703, Tsar Peter I planned the course of the street as the beginning of the road to Novgorod and Moscow. The avenue runs from the Admiralty in the west to the Moscow railway station, and after veering slightly southwards to Vostania Square to the Alexander Nevsky Lavra. Back to the text. En route, there was some shooting, but a heavy downpour of rain calmed the mood a little. After this tour of the city, the demonstrators arrived at the Tauride Palace at about 5 in the afternoon, where they were joined by workers from the Putilov factory. I know that's an important factory, right? Yeah, it's a huge building. When the Kronstadt sailors arrived at the Tauride Palace, they demanded to speak to one of the socialist ministers who had been in the coalition government. The most left-wing of their number, the leader of the SR party, Viktor Chernov, the former Minister of Agriculture, agreed to speak to them. Wikipedia says Viktor Chernov lived from the 1873 to 1952 and was a Russian revolutionary and one of the founders of the Russian Socialist Revolutionary Party. Chernov was the primary party theoretician, or the, quote, brain of the party, and was more of an analyst than a political leader. Following the February Revolution of 1917, Viktor Chernov was Minister for Agriculture in the Russian Provisional Government and advocated immediate land reform. Later on, Viktor Chernov was chairman of the Russian Constituent Assembly. Back to the text. Viktor Chernov made a short speech blaming the liberals for precipitating the crisis, and then a voice in the crowd called for the nationalization of the land. The throng surged forward, and angry demonstrators grabbed Chernov and pushed him into a nearby car, declaring he was under arrest. When news of the incident was brought to the Soviet executive by a group of workers, Trotsky was the first to intervene. Pushing people aside, he rushed to Chernov's rescue. His initial plan was to accompany the arrested Chernov out of the square and then quietly negotiate his release, but he was persuaded that the crowd's indiscipline needed to be confronted. He climbed into the bonnet of the open car and began to speak. He struggled to make himself heard. The sailors refused to shake his hand. For a while he was lost for words, but in the end he persuaded the sailors to release their captive. and Trotsky was allowed to take Chernov by arm and bring him back to the Tauride Palace. Despite this attempt by Trotsky to defuse the situation and keep the demonstration within bounds, the violence displayed on the day played into the hands of the provisional government. During the night of the 4th to the 5th of July, units loyal to the Soviet executive and provisional government began to arrive, and by midday on the 5th, these troops were in full control of the capital. At the same time, the provisional government announced that it had evidence that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were funded by the Germans, and their plans to seize power and surrender the country had only just been thwarted. On the morning of the 5th of July, Trotsky met Lenin, who was in a gloomy mood. Quote, "Now they will shoot us down one by one," end quote, Lenin said. With a warrant out for his arrest, Lenin felt he had no choice but to go into hiding. Zinoviev and Kamenev had already been taken into custody. Trotsky was not on the wanted list and did not abandon Soviet work. The Bolshevik group in the Soviet was now leaderless after Kamenev's arrest, so approached Trotsky to address them and give them leadership, even though, strictly speaking, Trotsky was not yet a member of the Bolshevik faction. This Trotsky did willingly. On the 10th of July, Trotsky decided to go further. Lunacharsky had made some statements after the July days which had been seized on by the press as a sign of division between the interdistrict group and the Bolsheviks. Trotsky defended the action of the Bolsheviks during the July days, both on the floor of the Soviet and in the executive, and published an open letter to the provisional government in which he stressed that the interdistrict group had supported the Bolsheviks fully. With rhetorical flourish, he ended, quote, "You can have no grounds for exempting me from the action of the decree by virtue of which Lenin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev are subjected to arrest," end quote. The provisional government called his bluff and arrested him on the 23rd of July. Footnote, Trotsky, My Life. End footnote. New section, towards October. Trotsky was released from prison on the 2nd of September without having to make use of the penknife that his wife had carefully smuggled to him on a family visit under the eyes of his excited sons. By then, the political situation in revolutionary Russia had changed completely. While Trotsky was in prison, a second coalition government had been formed, but it proved to be even less stable than the first. The new Prime Minister, Alexander Kerensky, appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the Army General Lever Kornilov, whose troops on the southwest front had achieved some success during the ill-started June offensive. And that's referring to the Kerensky offensive. Just a little background. The Kerensky offensive, also called the Summer Offensive, the June Offensive in Russia, or the July Offensive in Western historiography, took place from the 1st of July to the 19th of July 1917, and was the last Russian offensive of World War I. After the abdication of Emperor Nicholas II during the February Revolution, the Russian Provisional Government pledged to fulfill Russia's existing commitments to the Triple Entente, which included launching an offensive in the spring of 1917. The operation was directed at capturing Lemberg and the rest of Galicia from Austria-Hungary. The southwestern front of the Russian army was tasked with the offensive. As it was the least affected by revolutionary agitation, it would be mostly fighting Austria-Hungary, which had not fully recovered from the Brusilov offensive. The main attack was launched by the 7th Army and 11th Army, which made a limited advance, though the 11th Army's Czechoslovak Brigade notably captured the town of Zaborov from the Austrians. Further in the south, General Lever Kornilov's 8th Army was more successful, pushing back the Austrian 3rd Army and creating a breach along the front that was 30 kilometers, 19 miles wide, leading to the capture of the towns of Kalush and Galich. Secondary attacks to assist the main offensive were also launched by the Russian, Western, Northern, and Romanian fronts in other locations, but they were mostly unsuccessful with the exception of the one in the Romanian theater. The advance in the first days was in large part due to the volunteer shock battalions that were recruited and organized by the provisional government in the spring of 1917, but they were too few in number to hold the line against a counterattack by German reinforcements, and the regular infantry were less reliable. The Russian forces were then pushed back after the 19th of July, losing all the territory they had gained. The Germans and Austrians continued advancing into Russian territory by as much as 120 kilometers. By the time the German counteroffensive was over on the 5th of August, nearly all of eastern Galicia had been retaken by the Central Powers. The retreat of the Russian army eventually stopped, and Kornilov managed to stabilize the front by mid-August, but the failure of the operation eliminated the offensive potential of the Russian army and increased support for the Bolsheviks among the troops. The offensive was a disaster for Kerensky and the provisional government, contributing to the July days in the Kornilov affair. General Kornilov, the leader of the most successful Eighth Army, was appointed the commander of the Southwestern Front and then Army Supreme Commander just days later, because Kerensky hoped he could restore discipline and order among the retreating troops. He also gained support from conservative circles. In September, they decided to launch a coup against the Petrograd Soviet. But the Kornilov coup failed when his troops refused to fight and instead strengthened the revolutionary tendencies among soldiers. The collapse of the provisional government's popularity as a result of the offensive, and even more so after the Kornilov coup, was critical to the Bolsheviks increasing their influence over both the army and the Petrograd Soviet shortly before the October Revolution. And the Kornilov affair, because I know it's about to come up real quick. The Kornilov affair, the Kornilov Putsch, was an attempted military coup d'etat by the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, General Lever Kornilov, from the 10th to the 13th of September 1917, against the Russian provisional government headed by Alexander Kerensky and the Petrograd Soviet of Soldiers and Workers' Deputies. The exact details and motivations of the Kornilov affair are unconfirmed due to the general confusion of all parties involved. Many historians have had to piece together varied historical accounts as a result. Back to the text. Kornilov, however, was an inveterate plotter against the revolution, having first considered restoring order by force in April 1917. Kornilov's summer campaign for the restoration of discipline in the rapidly disintegrating army through the restoration of the death penalty made Kornilov the rallying point of all counter-revolutionary forces. On the 13th to the 14th of August, a state conference was held in Moscow to try to rally to Kerensky's side groups of all political shades, from the Soviet on the left to the former Duma deputies on the right. By then, plans were already well advanced for Kornilov to seize power and arrest the Soviet. Kerensky discovered the threat to his position on the 26th of August, but Kerensky could not resist Kornilov by appealing to the Soviet to mobilize its forces in defense of the revolution. Let me repeat that sentence. I fucked it up. I said it wrong. Kerensky discovered the threat to his position on the 26th of August, but Kerensky could only resist Kornilov by appealing to the Soviet to mobilize its forces in the defense of the revolution. This he did, and the Soviet saved both Kerensky and the revolution. Trotsky went straight from Kresty prison to a meeting of the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, which had been established by the Soviet. Within the Soviet itself, Kornilov's attempted putsch had prompted a radical turn to the left, practically among the soldier delegates. Just before Trotsky's release on the 1st of September, the Soviet had supported a Bolshevik resolution for the first time. The Menshevik and SR leaders of the Soviet decided to test whether this vote had been a, quote, one-off, or marked a complete change of direction, and so called a vote for the 9th of September. It was Trotsky's first public appearance at the Soviet since his release, and the vote was won. 2 days later, there was an even more convincing Bolshevik victory after another display of Trotsky's oratory. While Trotsky was in prison, the Bolshevik Central Committee, despite the formal merger of the Bolsheviks and the interdistrict group, have rejected a proposal that Trotsky join the editorial board of Pravda. This decision was reversed on the 6th of September, for all Bolsheviks could appreciate Trotsky's ability to influence the Soviet. With Lenin still hiding and Trotsky's oratorical skills plain for all to see, Trotsky was to dominate the public face of Bolshevism for the next 6 weeks. The issue facing the country in the aftermath of Kornilov's attempted putsch was whether to follow Kerensky and form a new third coalition government with the liberals, or the time had come to form a Soviet government, the policy of the Bolsheviks. To win popular backing for his proposal for a third coalition government, Kerensky summoned an assembly known as the Democratic Conference, made up not only of the Soviets but that now existed throughout Russia, but also of other democratically elected organizations such as trade unions, cooperatives, and local, town, and provincial councils. Wikipedia says the All-Russian Democratic Conference was a meeting of representatives of political parties and public organizations held in Petrograd from the 27th of December to October 5th, 1917. The outcome of the meeting was the creation of the pre-parliament. Back to the text. The Democratic Conference opened on the 14th of September, and Trotsky read the official statement made in the Bolshevik Party's name. After a series of rather contradictory votes, Kerensky won support for his proposal that a third coalition government be formed. However, the majority of delegates to the Democratic Conference insisted that this government should be held responsible to a temporary popular assembly so that the government and the government's policies could be monitored until elections to a national constituent assembly were held in mid-November. The proposed temporary assembly was given the name of the pre-parliament, and the key issue of debate at the Democratic Conference then became, would all political parties be willing to take part in the work of the pre-parliament, which would be comprised not only of those social groups represented at the Democratic Conference, but also representatives of property owners and their organizations. The Bolsheviks discussed the issue of participation in the pre-parliament on the 20th of September 1917 at a conference which included delegates to the Democratic Conference, members of the Petrograd Committee, and members of the Central Committee. Trotsky called for the pre-parliament to be boycotted. He was already thinking in terms of an insurrection, having made clear in the party's opening declaration to the Democratic Conference that the only real bulwark against counter-revolution was to arm the workers. However, the majority of those present were not agreed that the time was right to abandon parliamentary struggle. No agreement could be reached in the Central Committee, and it was left to the Democratic Conference delegates themselves to decide, and they voted to participate. On the 22nd of September, the Bolsheviks informed the Democratic Conference that they would take part in the pre-parliament. Footnote. For the pre-parliament more generally, see Geoffrey Swain's article, Before the Fighting Started, a discussion on the theme of the, quote, third way, end quote, end quote. Revolutionary Russia, Revolutionary Russia, the Journal Revolutionary Russia, number 2, 1991, end footnote. Trotsky's call for a boycott of the pre-parliament meant that he and Lenin were on the same wavelength. From his place of hiding in Finland, Lenin had briefly favored what might be termed the parliamentary way forward. The turn of the Petrograd Soviet in favor of the Bolsheviks in the immediate aftermath of Kornilov's failed putsch had suggested that the Bolsheviks could well be in a position to dominate any sort of socialist coalition government which might emerge from a body like the Democratic Conference. However, even at the Democratic Conference assembled and Kamenev called on it to establish a new government that very day, Lenin changed his mind and rejected such a way forward. Thereafterwards, Lenin bombarded the Bolshevik Central Committee with a series of letters ever more urgently urging them to prepare to seize power through an armed uprising. When Lenin heard of Trotsky's stance on boycotting the pre-parliament, he sent back the message, quote, "Bravo, Comrade Trotsky," end quote. However, although both Lenin and Trotsky were calling for an armed uprising to establish a workers' government, their visions of how this was to be achieved were far from identical. Lenin favored a coup staged by the Bolshevik Party and its military organization of radicalized soldiers. Trotsky favored action through the Soviets. At the very close of the Democratic Conference, it had been decided to summon a second Congress of Soviets to take place in Petrograd on the 20th of October. Trotsky assumed that this would be the occasion for action, and he made sure he took the Soviet firmly under his control. Ever since the pro-Bolshevik vote of the 9th of September, which had forced the resignation of the Soviets' Menshevik and SR leadership, negotiations had been underway about forming a new Soviet executive. These negotiations were finally completed on the 25th of September, and Trotsky knew where he stood. The new executive comprised 13 Bolsheviks, 6 SRs, and 3 Mensheviks, and its first act was to endorse Trotsky as president. The very first resolution passed set Trotsky's agenda. It called for the Third Coalition government to resign and announced that the forthcoming Second Congress of Soviets would create a genuinely revolutionary government. As a result of Lenin's interventions, including a threat to resign, the Bolshevik Central Committee reopened the question of participating in the work of pre-parliament. On the 5th of October, it was decided the Bolsheviks would stage a demonstrative walkout on the first day. Thus, it was Trotsky who, on the 7th of October, was given permission to make a special announcement during the opening ceremony and used it to denounce the pre-parliament as a, quote, council of counter-revolutionary connivance, end quote, in cahoots with, quote, this government of treason to the people, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky's peroration ended. Peroration? Peroration means the concluding part of a speech typically intended to inspire enthusiasm in the audience. Trotsky's peroration ended, quote, the revolution and the people are in danger. The government is intensifying this danger and the ruling parties are helping it. Only the people can save themselves and the country. We address the people. Long live an immediate, honest, democratic peace. All power to the Soviets, all land to the people. Long live the Constituent Assembly, end quote. Trotsky. With this, the Bolshevik delegates walked out. Footnote. See R.P. Browder and A.F. Kerensky, the Russian Provisional Government documents. The Russian Provisional Government 1917 documents. I don't see any description of that book. End footnote. Although Trotsky was committed to Soviet insurrection, the precise agent of that insurrection was still unclear at this time. Trotsky was certain that it could not be the Bolshevik Party as such, but that was all. Ironically, it was the Mensheviks who resolved this conundrum. With the German army apparently preparing to march in the capital and the government drafting plans to evacuate the seat of government to Moscow, the Mensheviks introduced into the Soviet on the 9th of October a proposal that a committee of revolutionary defense be formed to help defend the capital. To the surprise of many, Trotsky and the Bolshevik faction backed the proposal. As Trotsky noted in his History of the Russian Revolution, while the Bolshevik military organization had begun to draft plans for a possible uprising, quote, the one difficulty they had not yet got over was that of reconciling an instrument of insurrection with an elective and openly functioning Soviet, upon whose benches, moreover, sat representatives of the hostile parties. The patriotic proposal of the Mensheviks, therefore, came up most appropriately, end quote. A military committee of the Soviet rather than the military organization of the Bolshevik Party was in Trotsky's mind the perfect instrument to carry out an insurrection. On the 10th of October, the Bolshevik Party met to debate the issue of insurrection. Lenin put the case for an immediate putsch using forces assembled at Minsk for the Congress of Soviets of the Northern region. Evidence suggested, Lenin argued, that a second Kornilov coup was in preparation and so prompt action was needed. As Trotsky noted, quote, the task of insurrection Lenin presented directly as the task of the party. The difficult question of bringing the insurrection's preparation into accord with the Soviets is as yet not touched upon. The All-Russian Congress of the Soviets does not get a word, end quote. Kamenev, supported by Zinoviev, put the case against insurrection, but he had been arguing since the opening of the Democratic Conference. Both argued that events were moving in the Bolsheviks' favor. They would secure a majority in the Second Congress of the Soviets. They could win a third of the seats in the Constituent Assembly when elections were held in mid-November. And the SRs were so riven with dissension because of their support for Kerensky that there was bound to be a split, and the left SRs would be bound to support the Bolsheviks in the Constituent Assembly because of their commitment to radical land reform. The Bolsheviks were therefore likely to be the dominant party in a democratically elected socialist coalition government without having to resort to the gamble of seizing power. Footnote: for the differing tactics of Lenin and Trotsky at this time, see J.D. White, that's James D. White, I believe, Lenin, Trotsky, and the Art of Insurrection, the Congress of Soviets of the Northern Region, 11th to 13th of October 1917, published in 1999 in Slavonic and East European Review. End footnote. Neither Lenin's views nor those of Zinoviev and Kamenev were accepted. The Central Committee voted in favor of the principle of insurrection, but sketched out no plan, however tentative, of how it might take place. Not even a clear time scale was established in the resolution, although Trotsky recalled that it was informally agreed that as a guide date, something should happen by the 15th of October, in other words, in association with the Congress of Soviet of the Northern Region, which was scheduled for the 11th to the 13th of October. However, things did not work out as anticipated by Lenin. On the 12th of October, Trotsky guided through the draft resolution establishing the Soviet's Military Revolutionary Committee, MRC, as the Committee for Revolutionary Defense was rechristened. On the 13th of October, it was endorsed by the Soldiers section of the Soviet. Trotsky then moved to the Congress of the Soviets of the Northern Region, where Trotsky subtly subverted Lenin's plans. Although the resolution he put to the Congress was, in his words, quote, an almost undisguised summons to insurrection, end quote, it was a summons to insurrection on the 20th of October, when the All-Russian Congress of Soviets was due to meet. It had nothing in common with Lenin's plan that the Congress of Soviets of the Northern Region should act as the cover for the Bolshevik military organization immediately sending troops to Petrograd in support of a Bolshevik insurrection. The Latvian riflemen who rallied to Trotsky's call made clear that they would, quote, defend the Congress of Soviets, end quote. They said nothing about supporting a Bolshevik coup. Wikipedia says the Latvian riflemen were originally a military formation of the Imperial Russian Army assembled starting 1915 in Latvia in order to defend Baltic governorates against the German Empire in World War I. Initially, the battalions were formed by volunteers, and from 1916 by conscription among the Latvian population. A total of about 40,000 troops were drafted into the Latvian Rifleman Division. They were used as an elite force in the Imperial and Red Armies. Back to the text. Trotsky had co-opted the leaders of the Congress of the Soviets of the Northern Region to his policy rather than Lenin's, and several of them joined Trotsky on the, what's MRC again? What's the exact word? Military Revolutionary Committee. When the Bolshevik Central Committee next met on the 16th of October, Kamenev could rightly point out that almost a week had passed and nothing had been done. There was no apparatus for an insurrection. All the resolution of the 10th of October had done was to warn Kerensky what was afoot and give the government time to prepare a crackdown on the Bolshevik Party. This is an expanded meeting of the Central Committee, including representatives of the Petrograd Party Committee, the military organization, and members of the Soviet. Its purpose was to try to get more consensus on the issue of the insurrection. Kamenev and Zinoviev called for the policy of insurrection to be dropped, and again Lenin wanted an immediate insurrection. Lenin therefore interpreted as shilly-shally on Trotsky's part the statement made by the representative he sent to the meeting from the Military Revolutionary Committee. This made clear that insurrection should remain on the agenda, but that no precise date should be set. Quote, "Our task is to bring armed force to support an insurrection if one flares up anywhere," end quote. And it was likely that any move by the government on the question of troop movements could spark such a crisis. In the elliptical phase of the Central Committee minutes, Trotsky's representative stated, quote, "It is not necessary to worry about who shall begin, for the thing is already begun," end quote. Lenin wanted the Bolsheviks to seize power before the Second Congress of Soviets assembled. Wikipedia says, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets of Workers and Soldiers Deputies was held on November 7th to 9th, 1917 in Smolny, Petrograd. It was convened under the pressure of the Bolsheviks on the All-Russian Central Executive Committee of the First Congress of Soviets of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. Back to the text. Trotsky believed that defending the Congress from possible government attack was likely to present the opportunity for a seizure of power. Trotsky would be proved right, even though the Congress itself was postponed from the 20th to the 26th. In any event, the idea of the Bolsheviks staging a coup on their own behalf had been moved off the agenda by the decision of Kamenev to resign from the Central Committee, and published in the left Menshevik press an explanation of why he and Zinoviev opposed an insurrection. By the 18th of October, the press was full of comment on Bolshevik plans for insurrection. Trotsky recognized that Lenin's idea of unilateral action by the Bolsheviks was so unpopular that rumors of it had to be denied. As Trotsky recalled later, alarm, quote, penetrated even the workers' section and still more the regiments. To them, too, it began to seem as though a coming out were being prepared without them, end quote. So he resolved to make a statement both to the Soviet and on its behalf in which he outlined his strategy for revolution. Quote, "The decisions of the Petrograd Soviet are published for public information. The Soviet is an elective institution. Every deputy is responsible to his electors. This revolutionary parliament cannot adopt decisions that would be withheld from the knowledge of all the workers and soldiers. They want at this time to clear Petrograd of Petrograd's garrison. This is perfectly understandable because they know that the Congress of Soviets will definitely pass a resolution transferring power to the Congress, for the immediate conclusion of truces on all fronts, and for the transfer of land to the peasants. The bourgeoisie knows this and, therefore, wants to arm all the forces that are subordinate to it against us. This lie and slander is, in fact, the preparation for an attack against the Congress. ... We have not set a date for the attack, but the opposing side has, evidently, already set it. We will meet it, we will repel it duly, and we will declare that at the first counter-revolutionary attempt to hamper the work of the Congress, we will answer with a counter-offensive which will be ruthless and which we will carry out to the end," end quote. Trotsky. To Trotsky's fury, Kamenev, sitting next to him, jumped to his feet and stated that he endorsed Trotsky's statement fully, implying that the statement was a rejection of the insurrection rather than a rather tortuous explanation of how the insurrection would take place. Immediately after the incident, Trotsky met with Lenin and tried to reassure Lenin that he was still committed to insurrection, and if they were patient, the opportunity to act would yet present itself. Lenin was worried that the Bolsheviks would be caught napping, and his concerns were understandable. Although the Military Revolutionary Committee had been established in principle on the 9th of October and endorsed by the Soldiers section a few days later, it was a whole week after the 9th that a full plenary session of the Soviet endorsed the initiative and further 4 days before its composition was agreed. The Mensheviks and SRs refused to work in this committee they had first proposed when it became clear that the Bolshevik majority believed the only way to defend the capital was to overthrow the government. Only the left SRs, in the process of separating themselves from the SR majority, were prepared to work with the Bolsheviks on the Military Revolutionary Committee, and to underline its non-party status, Trotsky insisted that a left SR took the chair of the ruling bureau. These delays meant that it was only on the 20th of October that the Military Revolutionary Committee began to function fully. When the Bolshevik Central Committee met on the 20th of October, it was not planning insurrection, but squabbling about the behavior of Kamenev and Zinoviev. Trotsky, still smarting at the way Kamenev had outmaneuvered him on the 18th, insisted on clarifying the meaning of his statement to the Soviet and called for Kamenev's behavior to be put to a party court. This did not happen, but Trotsky was one of the majority who insisted that Kamenev's resignation letter be accepted. Stalin, who had agreed to a statement by Zinoviev being published in Pravda and had tried to smooth over the disagreement between Lenin and his comrades, also felt duty-bound to tender his resignation, but this was not accepted. It was only on the 21st of October that any real progress was made towards the insurrection. New section. Uprising. Despite Lenin's concern, below the surface, Trotsky's strategy was beginning to bear fruit. Not only had he got the Soviet to establish the Military Revolutionary Committee, but it had agreed to call a conference of the Petrograd garrison, which took place on the 18th to the 21st of October. This made clear that the garrison had no confidence in the provisional government and would be prepared to take armed action in defense of the revolution if called to do so by the Petrograd Soviet or the Congress of Soviets. While the garrison's support for the policy of the Military Revolutionary Committee, late in the night of the 21st, Trotsky sent 3 of the Military Revolutionary Committee bureau members to talk to General Polkovnikov of the Petrograd District military headquarters and asked him to accept that, henceforth, all orders would have to be countersigned by the Military Revolutionary Committee. Wikipedia says Georgy Petrovich Polkovnikov lived from 1883 to 1918 and was a Russian military leader, commander-in-chief of the Petrograd Military District in September to October 1917. His last military rank was colonel. Back to the text. The proposal was turned down, and the Military Revolutionary Committee reported to the Soviet that it had broken with headquarters. A gauntlet had been thrown down, but it was still unclear how things would develop. On this 22nd of Sunday, October, on Sunday the 22nd of October, Sunday the 22nd of October had been designated Soviet Day, a day of peaceful meetings and demonstrations, and Trotsky spent it addressing public meetings. Trotsky's performance at the People's House was observed by Nikolai Sukhanov, a left Menshevik journalist. When he arrived, he saw Trotsky, quote, flying along the corridor toward me onto the stage, end quote. Quote, Trotsky at once began to heat up the atmosphere with Trotsky's skill and brilliance, ... Quote, the Soviet government will give everything the country contains to the poor and the men in the trenches, end quote. ... All around me was a mood bordering on ecstasy, ... The crowd of thousands as one man raised their hands, ... Trotsky rapped out the words, quote, let this vote of yours be your vow, with all your strength and at any sacrifice to support the Soviet, which has taken on itself the glorious burden of bringing to a conclusion the victory of the revolution and of giving land, bread, and peace, end quote. Trotsky, end quote. Sukhanov. Speeches like this had their effect. During the 22nd, the Military Revolutionary Committee was approached by representatives of Petrograd headquarters looking for a possible compromise. As Trotsky later explained, by the time these proposals were discussed on the 23rd of October, it was already too late. Quote, on Saturday, these conditions of semi-honorable capitulation would have been accepted. Today, on Monday, they were already too late. Headquarters awaited an answer which never came, end quote. Not only had the popular mood changed, but by the 23rd, the Military Revolutionary Committee had got down to drafting a detailed plan of operations. As Trotsky recalled it, it was basically very simple. Chosen detachments are allocated to seize strategic points of the capital when a signal was given. The key to success was to win over as many garrison units to support the Military Revolutionary Committee or to ensure that they remained neutral in the forthcoming struggle. A key moment came on the afternoon of the 23rd when Trotsky addressed the garrison of the Peter Paul fortress at the very heart of the capital and persuaded its members to follow the MRC. Later in the day, the troops responsible for the arsenal also came out in support of the MRC, the Military Revolutionary Committee. What made Lenin nervous was that all this activity was being undertaken not in the name of a seizure of power, but of defending the Second Congress of Soviets from possible government attack. As Trotsky recalled, quote, that word insurrection was not spoken by any one of the leaders, end quote. Trotsky. When the Military Revolutionary Committee reported to the Soviet on the evening of the 23rd, it listed those units which now stated that they would obey the orders of the Military Revolutionary Committee rather than the untrustworthy government, but the logic that crowding out the government implied its overthrow was never spelled out. The Soviet backed the actions of the Military Revolutionary Committee in the spirit that they were measures to defend the Congress of Soviets, and it was up to Kerensky to attack. As Trotsky commented, quote, the political setup of the revolution was so favorable that frankness itself became a kind of camouflage, end quote. Trotsky. Kerensky acted on the morning of the 24th and closed down the Bolshevik and Soviet press. At the same time, he cut the Smolny telephone lines, resolved to prosecute members of the Military Revolutionary Committee, and demanded the removal of all Military Revolutionary Committee commissars. Trotsky sent troops to reopen the Bolshevik press, but by reopening the presses had embarked on an insurrection. As he noted later, quote, although an insurrection can win on the offensive, it develops better the more it looks like self-defense, end quote. Trotsky. See Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 3. When the Central Committee met on the 24th, its task was to try to give organizational form to a process that was already underway. And yet the central ambiguity of what was taking place remained. Was power actually being seized, or was all this military activity simply intended to ensure the Second Congress of Soviets met and had the opportunity to resolve the political future of the country? Trotsky dared not come clean, even with the Bolshevik caucus gathering for the opening of the Second Congress of Soviets. Quote, it was still impossible to throw off the defensive envelope of the attack without creating confusion in the minds of certain units of the garrison, end quote. When a delegation from the Petrograd City Council approached the Petrograd Soviet on the afternoon of the 24th for an explanation as to what was going on, Trotsky reassured them that, quote, the question of power is to be decided by the Congress of Soviets, ... If the Congress declines power, the Petrograd Soviet will submit, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. See Trotsky, History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 3. During the morning news had come in that the bicycle battalion of the Peter Paul fortress, which had not attended Trotsky's meeting on the previous day, was still loyal to Kerensky. Wikipedia says, the Peter and Paul Fortress is the original citadel of St. Petersburg, Russia, founded by Peter the Great in 1703 and built to Domenico Trezzini's designs from 1706 to 1740. as a star fortress. Between the first half of the 1700s and the early 1920s, it served as a prison for political criminals. It has been a museum since 1924. End footnote. Back to the text. During the morning news had come in that the bicycle battalion of the Peter Paul Fortress, which had not attended Trotsky's meeting on the previous day, was still loyal to Kerensky. The Military Revolutionary Committee cut the telephone connection to the battalion, and at 4 in the afternoon, Trotsky dashed to a meeting and persuaded them to abandon Kerensky. But as he still explained afterwards to an extraordinary session of the Petrograd Soviet, the Military Revolutionary Committee had been established not to carry out an insurrection but to defend the revolution. Trotsky's speech at this session shows clearly the full ambiguity or camouflage, to use Trotsky's later assessment of what was going on. The Military Revolutionary Committee, he insisted, was not afraid to shoulder responsibility for maintaining order and believed in the principle of, quote, all power to the Soviets, end quote. But the issue of power would be decided by the Congress, quote. At the forthcoming session of the All-Russian Congress of the Soviets, this principle ought to be put into effect. Whether this will lead to an insurrection or to any other form of action depends not only and not so much on the Soviets as on those who, in defiance of the people's unanimous will, still hold governmental power, end quote. Yet, having on the one hand suggested that the Second Congress of Soviets would decide whether or not there was to be an insurrection, he went on, quote, tomorrow the Congress of Soviet opens. It is the task of the garrison and of the proletariat to put at its disposal the power they have gathered, a power on which any governmental provocation will founder. It is our task to carry this power, undiminished and unimpaired, to the Congress, end quote. Here the clear implication was that power had already been seized. And would be offered to the Congress of Soviets, which in theory could reject it. Finally, Trotsky stated, quote, if the illusory government makes a hazardous attempt to revive its own corpse, the popular masses will strike a decisive counterblow, end quote. This suggested once again that an insurrection might precede the Congress of Soviets, if the government were to act. During the day, Kerensky was not inactive. In the afternoon, Kerensky addressed the pre-parliament, hoping to persuade it to endorse the moves he had made to challenge the Bolsheviks. But the pre-parliament refused Kerensky the vote of confidence he requested. Unabashed, he ordered that the railway stations be occupied by loyal troops, checkpoints established at major road intersections of the bridges across the river Neva be raised. The Military Revolutionary Committee responded by asking the crew of the battleship Aurora to restore movement to the Nikolaevsky Bridge, thus re-establishing traffic between the city center and large working-class district on Vasilevsky Island. Wikipedia says Aurora, the Russian cruiser Aurora, is a Russian protected cruiser currently preserved as a museum ship in St. Petersburg. Aurora was one of the 3 Pallada-class cruisers built in St. Petersburg for service in the Pacific. All 3 ships of this class served during the Russo-Japanese War. Aurora survived the Battle of Tsushima and was interned under U.S. protection in the Philippines and eventually returned to the Baltic Fleet. Aurora was most famous for her actions during the October Revolution, where Aurora reportedly fired the shot that signaled the beginning of the attack on the Winter Palace. So that's the Aurora.
Are you getting ready to take a shower?
See, I'm not saying anything for this bridge. And Vasilevsky Island. Wikipedia says Vasilevsky Island is an island in St. Petersburg, Russia, bordered by the Bolshaya Neva and Malaya Neva rivers in the delta of the Neva River in the south and northeast, and by Neva Bay of the Gulf of Finland in the west. Vasilevsky Island is separated from the Deka-Bristov Island by the Smolenka River. Together they form the territory of the Vasileo-Strovsky district and administrative division of St. Petersburg. Situated just across the river from the Winter Palace, it constitutes a large portion of the city's historic center. Two of the most famous St. Petersburg bridges, Palace Bridge and the Blagoveshchensky Bridge, connect it with the mainland to the south. The Exchange Bridge and the Tuchkov Bridge across the Malaya Neva connect it with Petrogradsky Island. Vasilevsky Island is served by Vasileostrovskaya and Primorskaya stations of St. Petersburg Metro. There are plans to build new metro stations on the Vasilyevsky Island by extending Line 4, the Orange Line, to the island. In addition, the island is serviced by bus routes and tramway lines. Back to the text. The captain of the battleship Aurora refused to implement the order, but agreed that he could be, quote, arrested, and then dutifully brought the ship towards the bridge, prompting Kerensky's guards to flee when the sailors lowered the bridge. At about the same time, the military revolutionary commissars gained access to the telephone exchange and restored the phone connections to Smolny. Government authority was being challenged, but power was not being seized. In Trotsky's words, quote, right up to the evening of the 24th, the umbilical cord of, quote, legality was not conclusively severed, end quote. Trotsky, History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 3. Around 6 in the evening on the 24th, Lenin wrote a letter to the Central Committee urging the party to end the ambiguity and seize power before what he called the wavering vote of the Second Congress of Soviets. Fearing that this, like other letters, was being ignored, Trotsky donned a disguise. Lenin donned a disguise and made his way to Smolny about midnight. Lenin's arrival acted as a catalyst. The Bolshevik military organization dusted off its plans for the seizure of key installations, and the operation began about 2 in the morning of the 25th. According to Trotsky's account, small groups, quote, usually with a nucleus of armed workers or sailors under the leadership of a commissar, end quote, occupied strategic sites such as the railway stations, the electricity network, bridges, the state bank, big printing plants, and the telegraph office. It was the work of a, quote, few thousand Red Guards and 2,000 or 3,000 sailors, end quote. Many were briefed by Trotsky, who could still hardly believe what he was saying. Quote, if you fail to stop them with words, use arms, end quote. Trotsky, History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 3. While these forces were being deployed, Trotsky was also called on to address a preliminary meeting of delegates to the Second Congress of Soviets that had been called by the executive elected at the First Congress of Soviets, i.e. the Menshevik and Right SR leadership. The meeting began about midnight and continued until 4 in the morning. At it, the Menshevik leader Fyodor Dan denounced the Bolshevik insurrection as paving the way to counter-revolution. Lunatics were leading the revolution to ruin, he suggested, just as happened in 1905, quote, when this same Trotsky stood at the head of the St. Petersburg Soviet, end quote. Wait, did I say footnote? Trotsky, History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 3. Where the hell am I? Shit, I'm spacing out. Okay. Alright, sorry. At it, the Menshevik leader Fyodor Dan denounced the Bolshevik insurrection as paving the way to counter-revolution. Lunatics were leading the revolution to ruin, Dan suggested, just as happened in 1905, quote, when the same Trotsky stood at the head of the St. Petersburg Soviet, end quote. At about 3 in the morning, Trotsky was called on to reply in the name of the Military Revolutionary Committee and the Bolshevik Party. Finally, the ambiguity was ended. Trotsky made clear that an insurrection was underway in which the Bolshevik Party was leading the masses. Trotsky dismissed the danger of counter-revolution, quote, if you do not weaken, there will be no civil war, for the enemy is already capitulating, and you can assume the place of master of the Russian land, which of right belongs to you, end quote. Trotsky. Sukhanov described it as a brilliant speech, but noted that it failed to arouse much enthusiasm from its tired audience. With his men on the street and the Soviet meeting over, Trotsky was left alone in the early hours of the 25th of October. In his memoirs, he recalled this decisive moment in the Smolny Institute. Quote, later on, Kamenev came in. Kamenev was opposed to the uprising, but Kamenev had come to spend that deciding night with me, and together we stayed in the tiny corner room on the 3rd floor, bracket, where the Military Revolutionary Committee was based, end bracket. So like the captain's bridge on that deciding night of the revolution, ... Quote, give me a cigarette, end quote. I say to Kamenev. I take 1 or 2 puffs, but suddenly the words, quote, only this is lacking, end quote. I faint. ... As I come to, I see Kamenev's frightening face bending over me. Quote, shall I get some medicine? End quote, he asks. Quote, it would be better, end quote. I answer after a moment's reflection. Quote, if you got something to eat, end quote. I try to remember when I last had food, but I cannot. At all events, it was not yesterday, end quote. Trotsky. That's from my life. Either Trotsky had collapsed from hunger, as Trotsky clearly believed, or Trotsky had experienced another of those fainting fits which accompanied moments of drama in his life. Trotsky recalled that at this stage, quote, the revolution was still too trusting, too generous, optimistic, and light-hearted. It preferred to threaten with arms than really use them, end quote. Trotsky. When dawn broke on the 25th, the insurrection seemed to stall. By 7 in the morning, the Supreme Army headquarters, Petrograd military headquarters, and Kerensky's government in the Winter Palace had no working telephones, but there was no sign that they were on the point of surrender. At 10 in the morning, Smolny broadcast that the provisional government had been overthrown. But this was still not the case. By midday, troops had persuaded the pre-parliament to disperse, but the government remained inside the Winter Palace. In the early afternoon, both Lenin and Trotsky addressed an emergency session of the Petrograd Soviet. But Trotsky's declaration that the provisional government had been overthrown was quickly followed by a clarification that the Winter Palace had still not been taken. The Bolsheviks were desperate that the overthrow of Kerensky's government should be complete by the time the Second Congress of Soviets was due to open at 8 in the evening, but still the Winter Palace was not in their hands. A wrangle with the Mensheviks delayed the opening of the Congress until well after 10 p.m., but as Trotsky paced backwards and forwards between the Congress Hall and the room where Lenin was based, the continuing sound of artillery fire confirmed that the Winter Palace remained in government hands. It only surrendered after 2 on the morning of the 26th. Trotsky claimed in his memoirs that it was Trotsky and Lenin Trotsky claimed that in his memoirs that it was as he and Lenin awaited the opening of the Congress of Soviets that Lenin became reconciled to the strategy of insurrection adopted by Trotsky. Lenin was clearly glad that the insurrection had taken place before the Congress of Soviets, but that had not, in fact, been Trotsky's intention. In his History of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky wrote that, quote, "The insurrection began earlier and ended later than had been indicated," end quote. Trotsky had assumed, as Trotsky stated repeatedly in public, that the insurrection would be a product of the Congress of Soviets and take place when it was in session. But Kerensky's action had prompted the Military Revolutionary Committee to act earlier, unexpectedly bringing the timing closer to that called for by Lenin. However, by acting before the Congress of Soviets had assembled, the veil of constitutionality had to be dropped, resistance by Kerensky's government was more stubborn, and the Winter Palace, unlike some of the earlier targets, held out much longer than expected. Thus, the Second Congress of Soviets, even with street fighting still underway, it was hardly surprising, therefore, when the first speaker, Martov, called for an end to civil war and a negotiated solution to the current crisis, Martov's speech was greeted with tempestuous applause. Sukhanov noted that this applause came from all over in the hall and concluded, quote, "It was manifest that a very great many Bolsheviks, not having assimilated the teachings of Lenin and Trotsky, would have been very happy to take precisely this path," end quote. Sukhanov. It was therefore up to Trotsky to rally his forces. Making perhaps his most famous speech, Trotsky asserted that revolutionary might was right, quote, "An instrument of the popular masses needs no justification, ... Our insurrection has conquered, and now you propose to us, renounce your victory, make a compromise. With whom, I ask, ... No, a compromise is no good here, ... To all who made like proposals, we must say, quote, you are pitiful, isolated individuals. You are bankrupts. Your role is played out. Go where you belong from now on, ... Into the dustbin of history," end quote. Trotsky. Cited in Sukhanov's Russian Revolution and Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 3. Sukhanov had been right to suspect that not all Bolsheviks shared Trotsky's vision. Lunacharsky followed Trotsky to the platform of the Second Congress of Soviets and explained that the Bolsheviks were not insisting on Trotsky's resolution against the compromise, and were in fact ready to reach an agreement about the formation of a government with other parties represented in the Soviet. Unable to agree on whether or not to form a new government, the Congress of Soviets decided on a half-hour recess at 2 a.m. When it reconvened, news had come through that the Winter Palace had fallen and Kerensky's ministers were under arrest. Only now did the Congress resolve under Kamenev's guidance to form a new Soviet government, a, quote, provisional workers' and peasants' government to be called the Council of People's Commissars, end quote, to administer the country, quote, until the meeting of the Constituent Assembly, end quote. Just as the Bolsheviks had failed to agree about whether or not to stage an insurrection, the Bolsheviks were not agreed about what sort of government to form. During the day of October 26, Lenin and Trotsky called an informal meeting of those Central Committee members who happened to be around and resolved to form a government comprised only of Bolsheviks. Trotsky described this as, quote, the only thinkable, end quote, proposal. However, later in the day, the Central Committee invited 3 representatives of the left SRs to a more formal meeting and proposed the formation of a coalition government. The left SRs turned this down, and so Kamenev was forced to read out only Bolshevik names as he listed the new People's Commissars. There were immediate protests from the left SRs and remaining Menshevik delegates. Trotsky again spoke for the intransigence.
In an extraordinary statement given his repeated attempts to, quote, camouflage the insurrection, Trotsky claimed that, quote, openly and before the face of the whole people we raised the banner of insurrection, end quote. Slightly more honestly, Trotsky commented, quote, they tell us, quote, they tell us, you did not await the Congress of Soviets with your uprising. We thought of waiting, but Kerensky would not wait, end quote. Although Bolshevik delegates were convinced by this bravado, the left SRs were not. They controlled the railwaymen's union, Vigel, and at the session closed on the 20 and as the session closed in the morning of the 27th of October, a Vigel delegate announced that no trains would move on the country's railway network until a negotiated settlement had been reached. Wikipedia says the All-Russian Executive Committee of the Union of Railwaymen, commonly known in English by its Cyrillic acronym Vikzhel, was the governing body of an industrial union established in revolutionary Russia during the summer of 1917. Inclined towards syndicalism and standing as one of the most radical Russian unions of the period, Vikzhel played a decisive role in stymieing the attempted Kornilov coup in August 1917. At the time of the October Revolution, Vikzhel was the largest and best organized union in Russia. Simultaneously but independent of the Bolshevik Party's seizure of power, Vikzhel would seize control of Russia's railways in the fall of 1917, favoring a multi-party government. Vikzhel managed to leverage its position of strength through threat of a general transportation strike to force the Bolsheviks to add other socialist political parties to the previously all-Bolshevik government, a power play culminated by the provision of 3 ministerial portfolios to representatives of the Left Socialist Revolutionary Party. Vikzhel's limited success in pushing the Bolsheviks towards compromise and moderation proved to be short-lived, however, as the fledgling Soviet government soon manufactured a split of the All-Russian Union of Railwaymen and established a rival governing executive committee known as Vikzhedor. Supplanted by the new Bolshevik-friendly organization, Vikzhel was ultimately dissolved in March 1918 by decree of the Governing Council of People's Commissars, or Sovnarkom. Back to the text. The Vikzhel negotiations from the 28th of October to the Vikzhel negotiations lasted from the 28th of October to the 4th of November. Those Bolsheviks like Kamenev and Zinoviev who had opposed an insurrection were keen to see their success. Trotsky and Lenin, who saw their purpose as simply removing the Bolsheviks' monopoly of power, and indeed they themselves personally from power, consistently sought to wreck them. While the talks proceeded, de facto power was in the hands of the Military Revolutionary Committee, and that power was used in 2 directions. To the horror of moderate socialists, the Military Revolutionary Committee behaved quite arbitrarily and targeted for repression not representatives of the bourgeoisie, but those moderate socialists associated with the Kerensky administration. The other target of the MRC was the army of Cossacks assembled by Kerensky after he had fled the city. Jointly, Lenin and Trotsky appointed the left SR colonel Mikhail Muraviev to lead those forces rapidly assembled to confront the Cossacks at Pulkovo Hill on the outside of Petrograd on the 30th to 31st of October. Trotsky observed the proceedings from the sidelines, issuing wild orders that for every revolutionary soldier killed, 5 enemy soldiers would be shot in their place. One second. Mikhail Muravyov lived from 1880 to 1918 and was a Russian officer who changed sides during the time of the Civil War in Russia and the Soviet-Ukrainian War. Mikhail Muravyov was born in Burdukova, a village near Vetluga in the Kostroma Governorate, to a peasant family. In 1898, he entered the army, serving in the Russo-Japanese War and World War II, in which he was a lieutenant colonel on the Southwestern Front. After the February Revolution, Mikhail Muravyov organized volunteer units to continue the war, but Mikhail Muravyov became disaffected with the provisional government and joined the left socialist revolutionaries. During the October Revolution, Mikhail Muravyov defended Petrograd against the forces of Alexander Kerensky. In January 1918, Mikhail Muravyov led Red Guard units against the Central Rada of Ukraine, and after the Battle of Kruty, his forces took Kiev, where they carried out mass terror against the officers of the Imperial Army and pro-Ukrainian elements. Then Mikhail Muravyov's forces fought for the Odessa Soviet Republic against the Romanians and Austro-Hungarians, and in spring of 1918 against the Don Cossack forces of General Kaledin. However, after Mikhail Muravyov had been named commander of the Eastern Front, fighting the Czechoslovak Legion, Mikhail Muravyov heard of the leftists' uprising against the Bolsheviks in early July and rebelled, sailing down the Volga with 1,000 men, hoping to take Simbirsk. Mikhail Muravyov was captured by the Bolsheviks, resisted arrest, and was shot while trying to draw a gun. Back to the text. While the Cossacks posed a threat, Lenin and Trotsky were prepared to let the Vikzhel talks continue as a way of buying time. When the Cossacks were sent packing, they saw no point in the discussions going on. There's a Wikipedia here titled The Kerensky-Krasnov Uprising. The Kerensky-Krasnov Uprising was an attempt by Alexander Kerensky to crush the October Revolution and regain power after the Bolsheviks overthrew Kerensky's government in Petrograd. The Kerensky-Krasnov Uprising took place between the 8th and 13th of November 1917, or in the old calendar, 26th to the 31st of October. Following the October Revolution, Kerensky fled Petrograd, which fell to the Bolshevik-controlled Petrograd Soviet, and went to Pskov, the headquarters of the Northern Front Command. Kerensky did not get the support of its commander, General Vladimir Cheremizov, who prevented his attempts to gather units to march on Petrograd, but he did get to the support of General Peter Krasnov, who advanced on the capital with about 700 Cossacks. In Petrograd, opponents of the October Revolution were preparing a revolt that would coincide with the attack on the city by Kerensky's forces. The Soviets had to improvise the defense of the hills south of the city and wait for the attack of Kerensky's troops, who, despite the efforts of the High Command, received no reinforcements. The clash in the Pulkovo Heights ended with the withdrawal of the Cossacks after the Yunker Mutiny, which failed prematurely, and they did not receive the necessary support from other units to force the defenses. Talks between the sides ended with Kerensky's flight, fearful of being handed over to the Soviets by his own soldiers, effectively ending attempts to restore the overthrown Russian provisional government. Back to the text. Trotsky informed Vikzel by telegraph on the 31st of October that he was not opposed to the idea of a coalition government formed from the Bolsheviks and leftist Rs, confirming that this had been proposed on the 26th of October. But he insisted that, in his view, the Vikzel negotiations were just being used as a cover while Kerensky rallied counter-revolutionary troops. Quote, talks are being held with democratic organizations and parties, but we will not allow negotiations with a bunch of Kornilovites, end quote. The next day, Trotsky told a session of the Petrograd Committee that the negotiations would lead nowhere. Here, Trotsky spelled out ideas implicit in his results and prospects, independent of action by the peasants. The petty bourgeoisie was impossible. Quote, we shall be able to draw the petite bourgeoisie behind us only by showing that we have in our hands a material fighting force, end quote. Trotsky, peasant radicalism had to be given a lead, and, quote, there was no point in organizing the insurrection if we do not get the majority, end quote. Trotsky, the Bolsheviks needed 3/4 of the seats in any government, and the government had to be headed by Lenin. The talks should be presented with an ultimatum. Back the decrees issued by the Bolshevik government or break up the talks. After what he later described as a, quote, incredible offer, end quote, Kamenev was able to persuade the Central Committee to a continuation of the Vikzel talks, but the issue was raised again in the Central Committee on the 2nd of November. Footnote. See Swain's Third Way and Trotsky's The Stalin School of Falsification. Lenin demanded that the Central Committee, quote, confirm that there can be no repudiation of the purely Bolshevik government without betraying the slogan of Soviet power, end quote. Trotsky agreed and signed the, quote, ultimatum from the Central Committee majority to the minority, end quote, drawn up by Lenin on the 3rd of November and presented to the Central Committee meeting of the 4th. At the meeting, Lenin and Trotsky got their way, prompting Zinoviev and Kamenev to resign in protest. Footnote. See Richard Pipes' The Unknown Lenin. The description for The Unknown Lenin from the Secret Archive, edited by Richard Pipes. The description says, was Lenin a visionary whose ideals were subverted by his followers, or was Lenin a cynical misanthrope even crueler than Stalin? This book, which contains newly released documents from the Lenin archive in Russia, lays bare Lenin the man and the politician, leaving little doubt that he was a ruthless and manipulative leader who used terror, subversion, and persecution to achieve his goals. Edited and introduced by eminent scholar Richard Pipes in collaboration with Y.A. Buranov of the Russian Center for the Preservation and Study of Documents of Recent History in Moscow. The documents date from 1886 to the end of Lenin's life. They reveal, among other things, that Lenin's purpose in invading Poland in 1920 was not merely to Sovietize that country, but to use it as a springboard for the invasion of Germany and England. Lenin took money from the Germans. Here we have the first incontrovertible evidence for this. In 1919, Lenin issued instructions to the communist authorities in the Ukraine not to accept Jews in the Soviet government of that republic. As late as 1922, Lenin believed in the imminence of social revolution in the West, and he planned subversion in Finland, Turkey, Lithuania, and other countries. Lenin had little regard for Trotsky's judgment on important matters and relied heavily on Stalin. Lenin assiduously tracked dissident intellectuals and urged repressive action or deportation. Lenin launched a political offensive against the Orthodox Church, ordering that priests who resisted seizure of church property be shot, quote, "the more the better," end quote. Back to the text and footnote. Lenin demanded, where am I? Yeah. New section, Brest-Litovsk. In Results and Prospects, Trotsky had argued that in the first stage of rule by a workers' government, virtually the whole nation would support it. But as its socialist agenda began to be implemented, the individualist aspirations of the peasantry would be offended, and soon the workers' government would be under peasant attack. The only way out of this dilemma was to spread the revolution to Europe. 2 months before the October insurrection, Trotsky had written, quote, "A lasting, decisive success is inconceivable for us without a revolution in Europe," end quote. And as the newly appointed Commissar for Foreign Affairs, that is what he sought to achieve. Trotsky had little time for conventional diplomacy. When the crisis over the formation of a Bolshevik government had passed, Trotsky made his first foreign policy statement to the Soviet experience on the 8th of November. Bolshevik policy, he said, was rooted in the peace decree adopted by the Congress of Soviets. Trotsky was confident that the Bolshevik government was now strong enough for foreign powers to reckon with it as a fact, whether they liked it or not. There were day-to-day practicalities like the issuing of visas which forced foreign powers to enter into normal relations, even with the Bolsheviks. Despite some attempts to frustrate his work, officials from the former Ministry of Foreign Affairs had shown him the secret treaties agreed between Imperial Russia and Britain and France, allocating Russia substantial territorial gains in the Balkans and elsewhere. These treaties would be published in full so that the world was clear about the imperialist nature of the First World War. The Bolsheviks were serious about peace, and the Allied ambassadors had all been informed that the new Council of People's Commissars had instructed the commander-in-chief of the Russian army to begin armistice discussions. At the same time, he had sent a radio appeal to both the Allied powers and the Central Powers, inviting them to conclude a general peace. It took time for the armistice to be implemented. The commander-in-chief of the Russian army informed Lenin that he did not recognize the Bolshevik government. While the Allies' response was to reject Trotsky's proposal for a general armistice and warned the commander that any separate talk with the Germans could have, quote, "the gravest consequences," end quote. The commander-in-chief was called on to resign and transfer authority to someone loyal to Lenin. When he queried on what authority he should do this, he was murdered in a bloody confrontation on the 21st of November. The Russian and German armistice delegations had first met 2 days earlier, and during the 4 days of talks, Trotsky tried to persuade the Germans to agree not to transfer troops to the Western Front. This proved impossible. The truce was finalized on the 22nd of November. Still hoping for a general rather than a separate peace, a further appeal was made to the Allies, but when no response was forthcoming, the Bolsheviks had no choice but to consider a separate peace. Trotsky appeared before the Soviet executive on the 8th of December to justify this stance, and in his speech outlined his personal agenda for the next 6 months. Quote, "The armistice has made a breach in the war. The gunfire has ceased, and everyone is nervously waiting to see how the Soviet government will deal with the Hohenzollern and Habsburg imperialists. You must support us in treating them as foes of freedom and ensuring that not one iota of this freedom is sacrificed to imperialism. ... We are becoming more and more convinced that peace talks will be a powerful weapon in the hands of other peoples in their struggle for peace. If we are mistaken, if Europe continues to be silent as the grave, and if this silence gives Wilhelm the chance to attack us and to dictate his terms to us, which would insult the revolutionary dignity of our country, then I am not sure whether, given our shattered economy and the general chaos, the result of the war and the war and internal strife, we could fight. I think, however, that we could do so. For our lives, for our revolutionary honor, we would fight to the last drop of our blood, ... raising, an army of soldiers and Red Guardsmen strong in its revolutionary enthusiasm." End quote. Trotsky. See J. Keep, The Debate on Soviet Power. I'm not seeing any description of this book, but the full title is The Debate on Soviet Power, Minutes of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee of Soviets, Second Convocation, October 7th, 1917 to January 1918, edited by John L.H. Keep. Back to the text. The talks at Brest-Litovsk got underway on the 9th of December, but progress was slow. After the formal opening, there was an adjournment, followed by postponements, and it was only on the 25th of December that the German demands became clear. On the 29th of December, the Soviet delegation returned to Petrograd, bringing with it what Trotsky called the monstrous demands of the Central Powers. After a brief discussion among the Bolshevik leadership, it was agreed that the only thing to do was to play for time, in the hope that a European revolution materialized. The negotiations had to be spun out for as long as possible, and Lenin insisted that, quote, "to delay the negotiations, there must be someone to do the delaying," end quote. Trotsky was ordered to head the delegation to set off, quote, "as if being led to a torture chamber," end quote. Shit. God damn it, I accidentally closed. Okay. Trotsky. My Life. That was what the quote's from. Okay. Sooner than Trotsky had arrived, no sooner than Trotsky had arrived, than Trotsky asked for an adjournment, arriving back in Petrograd on the 7th of January 1918. While en route, there had been dramatic developments in the capital. The Constituent Assembly had met and been dissolved on the 6th of January, and its place taken by the Third Congress of the Soviets. On the 8th of January, the Bolshevik Central Committee and leaders of the Bolshevik delegation to the Third Congress met to consider what to do, and Trotsky proposed a tactic of neither peace nor war. The Bolsheviks would simply not sign the treaty proposed by the Germans, but nor would they resume hostilities. The tactic presupposed that the German proletariat would rise up in fury when it saw how outrageously the German proletariat's imperialist government was behaving. The meeting accepted Trotsky's suggestion, but this was just an advisory vote. When the Central Committee resumed its discussion on the 11th of January, without the participation of extraneous delegates, Lenin and Trotsky clashed. Lenin felt that they had no choice but to accept the German terms. Quote, "What Comrade Trotsky suggests is political showmanship," end quote, Lenin argued. If the Germans attacked, the Bolsheviks would be forced to sign a worse peace. By 9 votes to 7, the meeting endorsed Trotsky's policy. Before returning to the negotiations, Trotsky put an optimistic gloss on the situation when he addressed the Third Congress of Soviets. Quote, "They cannot threaten us with an offensive, as they cannot be sure the German soldiers will take part in one, ... And if German imperialism attempts to crucify us in the wheel of its military machine, then ... we shall appeal to our elder brothers in the West and say, quote, 'Do you hear?' End quote. And the international proletariat will respond, 'We firmly believe this,' quote, 'We hear,' end quote, end quote." Trotsky. Just prior to Trotsky's departure, Trotsky and Lenin came to a private understanding which modified the, quote, "no peace, no war," end quote, decision of the Central Committee. Trotsky promised to sign the peace if Lenin's fears were realized and the Germans resumed hostilities. Footnote. See D. Volkoganov, Trotsky, the Eternal Revolutionary, and Deutscher, the Prophet Armed. The description of this book on Google Books says, together with Lenin, Trotsky was the most charismatic and dominating figure of the Russian Revolution, a dynamic public speaker, a brilliant organizer and theorist. He was largely responsible for advocating the system of state terror which was ultimately to lead to the nightmare of Stalinism. This biography describes Trotsky's career as a revolutionary before World War I and his roles successively as chief organizer of the October Revolution, military hero of the Russian Civil War, an outspoken critic of the Stalinist style of leadership. Widely regarded as Lenin's likely successor, Trotsky was outmaneuvered by his enemy Stalin and found himself expelled from the Communist Party, written out of the history of the revolution, exiled and finally murdered in Mexico by Stalin's agents. The author tracked down members of Stalin's overseas hit squad and found relatives of Trotsky in Russia. Combined with his access to Soviet archives, this biography lends insight into one of the most influential figures of the 20th century, whose faith in the world's socialist revolution remained undimmed to the end. And again, that's the description for Trotsky, Eternal Revolutionary by Dmitry Volkogonov. Back to the text and footnote. However, before, quote, "no peace, no war," end quote, became an issue, there remained the tactic of spinning out the negotiations. There were several ways of delaying the talks. Technical communications with Petrograd were poor. Trotsky insisted he had to be in regular correspondence with Petrograd, yet the direct wire communication system constantly broke down. Then there were the details to be explored. Trotsky protested about Russian POWs being subjected to German propaganda. The Germans responded in kind. Sometimes such points of detail were personal. Members of the Austro-Hungarian delegation were keen for the release of 2 personal friends held by the Russians and offered Trotsky in return the contents of the library he had left in Vienna at the start of the war. The gaps between sessions could be extended. Trotsky made a short visit to Warsaw and spent many hours dictating a history of the October Insurrection to the board stenographers who had previously worked for the State Duma. Initially, both sides were interested in such time wasting. The German tactic was to propose a democratic peace in line with President Woodrow Wilson's talk of the self-determination of nations. They would effectively break up the Russian Empire, allowing the Bolsheviks to control the Russian heartland, but establishing in the Baltic lands and in Ukraine German-sponsored independent regimes. The Germans needed time to persuade Ukrainian politicians to back this scheme, while the Bolsheviks needed time to put an end to the growing Ukrainian autonomy movement and establish Soviet power in Ukraine by force. The crisis came when the Germans had their Ukrainian delegation ready. Trotsky tried to argue that a revolution had occurred in Ukraine and that local Bolsheviks, supported by Russian Red Guardsmen, had established a Soviet Ukraine which had voluntarily formed a federation with Soviet Russia on the basis of a shared foreign policy. The Germans countered that Soviet Ukraine had been established by Russian force, and Trotsky was himself rather embarrassed by reports of the arbitrary way Colonel Muraviev, the same commander who had defeated the Cossacks at Pulkovo Hill, had subjugated Ukraine. On the 21st of January, when Muraviev captured Kiev, Trotsky notified the Central Powers that he did not recognize the Ukrainian delegation. At the same time, he informed Lenin that the negotiations could not be spun out much longer, and the quote, "no peace, no war," end quote, declaration would have to be made soon. Footnote. A more detailed account of events in Ukraine at this time can be found in Geoffrey Swain's book, The Origins of the Russian Civil War. The description for The Origins of the Russian Civil War by Geoffrey Swain says, concentrating on the turbulent months from February 1917 to November 1918, Geoffrey Swain explores the origins of the Civil War against the wider background of revolutionary Russia. Geoffrey Swain examines the aims of the anti-Bolshevik insurgents themselves, but he also shows how far the fear of civil war governed the actions of the provisional government and even the plans of the Bolsheviks. If the war itself can seem a fairly straightforward lineup of revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries, this study reveals how complex were the motives of the people who precipitated the Civil War. And the table of contents are the failed white counter-revolution, Lenin risks a red-green civil war, peace for renewed civil war, the British and patriotic socialists defending the socialist fatherland, the start of the red-green civil war, disunity in the green camp, green directory, white counter-revolution. Back to the text and footnote. On the 20th of January, the day after the Central Powers signed a separate treaty with the Ukrainian delegation, Trotsky made his final statement, quote, in expectation of the approaching hour when the working classes of all countries seize power, we are withdrawing our army and our people from the war and issuing an order for full demobilization, At the same time, we declare that the terms proposed to us by the governments of Germany and Austro-Hungary are in fundamental conflict with the interest of all people, We cannot put the signature of the Russian Revolution under a peace treaty which brings oppression, woe, and misfortune to millions of human beings, end quote. Trotsky. With this, the Russian delegation left. Trotsky was convinced that there was a disagreement within the German delegation between the military and political representatives, and that the political representatives were getting the upper hand. He therefore ignored the head of the Austro-Hungarian delegation, who came to see him secretly to warn him that Germans were preparing an offensive. He also ignored the views of the three Russian military advisors who had accompanied him to Brest. Back in the capital, he told the Petrograd Soviet on the 16th of February the Georgian calendar was introduced in Russia at the start of February 1918, so the 1st of February became 13th of February. Quote, I regard an advance by German troops against us as extremely unlikely, and if you reckon it in percentages, then it would be 90 against 10 for ... to send German troops to Russia now, when Russia was publicly declaring that it has left the state of war, would unquestionably mean provoking a mighty revolutionary protest by the German workers." End quote. Trotsky. Trotsky was terribly wrong. The Germans resumed hostilities on the 18th of February. Under the terms of the tacit agreement between Lenin and Trotsky, this was the point at which Trotsky should have agreed to sign the treaty. However, Trotsky had changed his mind. Lenin insisted that the Bolsheviks should offer to sign the treaty at once. Trotsky argued that the offensive should be allowed to begin, quote, so that the workers of Germany would learn of the offensive as a fact rather than as a threat, end quote. When the Central Committee met on the 17th of February, Trotsky voted for the principle of peace, but on the 18th refused to vote for the dispatch of the necessary telegram to the Germans. Trotsky reported that the German offensive had indeed begun with an aerial bombardment of the city of Dvinsk, but Trotsky argued, quote, the masses are only just beginning to digest what is happening, ... We have to wait and see what impression all this makes on the German people, end quote. Trotsky. Later that day, Trotsky informed the reconvened Central Committee that Dvinsk had now fallen, and it was time to make a direct appeal to the civilian politicians in Berlin and Vienna. Trotsky was behaving recklessly. He was saying what he wanted to see, just as he had done during the hunger strike in Odessa prison. Lenin insisted the time had come to sign, and Trotsky finally backed down. On the 19th of February, the Bolsheviks sued for peace and put Trotsky in charge of a committee for revolutionary defense. Declaring a willingness to sign the peace treaty was one thing, persuading the Germans to stop their advance quite another. Fighting had begun, and until Germans agreed to resume talks, they had to be resisted. Allied representatives have responded to the, quote, no peace, no war declaration by offering to aid Russia should hostilities resume. On the 18th of February, Trotsky was visited by the British representative in Russia, Bruce Lockhart, who offered British military support. Sir Robert Hamilton Bruce Lockhart lived from 1887 to 1970 and was a British diplomat, journalist, author, and secret agent. His 1932 book, Memoir of a British Agent, became an international bestseller by telling of his experiences in Russia in 1918 following the Bolshevik Revolution. Bruce Lockhart left the country after he was accused of having led a failed plot to assassinate Vladimir Lenin, the so-called ambassador's plot, a charge which he always denied. Back to the text. Lockhart found Trotsky surprisingly optimistic, quote, even if Russia cannot resist, Russia will indulge in partisan warfare to the best of her availability, end quote. Trotsky. However, when on the 20th of February Trotsky met with his key military advisors, they persuaded Trotsky that partisan operations could not hold back a modern army. The only thing to do was to retreat to a defensible line and hope to build up reserves. In the first instance, every effort should be made to hold the strategic town of Pskov. On the 21st of February, a Russian delegation had reached Brest-Litovsk, only to discover that the terms now offered by the Germans were, as Lenin predicted, far worse than the original terms. At first, even Lenin thought there was no choice but to fight for survival. Given this bleak scenario, it was not surprising that Trotsky continued to keep in contact with the Allies, not only with Lockhart, but with the French representatives as well. On the 22nd of February, he persuaded a skeptical Central Committee to accept a French offer of military aid. But the military situation was worsening all the time. On the 23rd of February, news came of the fall of Pskov, and a crisis meeting of military advisors predicted that Petrograd would soon fall too. When the Central Committee met later in the day, Lenin insisted that, quote, "this is where the policy of revolutionary phrase-mongering ends," end quote. Trotsky did not agree. Trotsky insisted that the party could, quote, "tackle the task of organizing defense," end quote. Even if Petrograd and Moscow were surrendered, quote, "we could hold the whole world in tension," end quote. The problem was, Trotsky said, that the party was not united, and, quote, "we cannot fight a revolutionary war when the party is split," end quote. Reluctantly, Trotsky would therefore resign as Commissar of Foreign Affairs and abstain in the forthcoming vote. On his abstention, Lenin's policy of signing the new German proposals was passed. Reflecting the tension within the ruling group at this time, Stalin queried whether it was possible for someone to resign from the government yet remain a party member, but Lenin would have nothing of such vindictiveness and insisted that Trotsky not only remain in the party, but in the government as well. New section, Rebuilding the Army. Trotsky resigned as Commissar for Foreign Affairs, but his responsibilities for coordinating the defense of Petrograd continued. Although a Bolshevik delegation set off to sign the new treaty on the morning of the 24th of February, the fighting continued. Indeed, at this time, the Russian army staged a small recovery and recaptured Pskov, holding the town for a couple of days. The treaty had still not been signed, and in these circumstances, Trotsky's contact with the Allies continued. On the 29th of February, Lenin met Lockhart and informed him that, quote, "so long as the German danger exists, I am prepared to risk cooperation with the Allies," end quote. The next day, a message was received requesting a train to bring back the Russian peace mission. Fearing the Germans had decided not to sign the peace treaty after all, Lenin held further talks with Lockhart and instructed the Soviet in Murmansk to cooperate with the British in moving military supplies. It was only on the 3rd of March that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed and the German advance halted. No sooner had the peace been signed than on the 4th of March the Bolsheviks established a Supreme Military Council and made Trotsky its chair. Trotsky had told the Soviet executive before the Brest-Litovsk negotiations started that if terms were dictated to them which, quote, "insulted the revolutionary dignitary of our country," end quote, then they would raise an army of soldiers, quote, "strong in its revolutionary enthusiasm," end quote. Trotsky. That is precisely what he now set out to do. At the extraordinary 7th Party Congress, held on the 6th to 8th of March to endorse the signing of the Brest Treaty, Trotsky followed a justification of his actions with a prediction that would guide his movement over the next few weeks. Quote, "the present breathing space can be reckoned to last no more than 2 or 3 months at best, and most likely only weeks and days," end quote. Trotsky. War with Germany would resume, and it was imperative to have a capable force ready for that day by disbanding the disintegrating army and building a new army. During the extraordinary Fourth Congress of Soviets on the 14th to the 16th of March, which ratified the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Trotsky was appointed Commissar of War. Trotsky's closest advisor in his campaign to construct an army capable of confronting the Germans by summer 1918 was General M.D. Bonch Bruevich, who had been among those who advised Trotsky against partisan warfare when the German advance began in February. Wikipedia says Mikhail Bonch-Bruyevich lived from 1870 to 1956. Mikhail Bonch-Bruyevich was an Imperial Russian and Soviet military commander, lieutenant general from 1944. His family belonged to the nobility of the former Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The son of a landed surveyor and a member of the minor nobility, Mikhail Bonch-Bruyevich graduated from the Moscow Institute of Surveying and later from the General Staff Academy. From 1892 to 1895, Bonch-Bruyevich served as an officer with the Lithuanian Guards Regiment posted at Warsaw. Back to the text. Trotsky's closest advisor in this campaign to construct an army capable of confronting the Germans by summer 1918 was the General M.D. Bonch-Bruyevich, who had been among those who advised Trotsky against partisan warfare when the German advance began in February. Together they began to draft a plan in the event of renewed German aggression for a fighting retreat beyond the river Volkhov. The river Volkhov, to be coordinated with the construction of defensive, quote, screens to protect Petrograd and Moscow. Allied representatives were closely involved in these preparations. Talks between Trotsky and Bruce Lockhart continued throughout March 1918. Indeed, when Trotsky traveled to Moscow after the decision to move the capital away from the German threat, Trotsky and Bruce Lockhart shared a railway compartment. There were other examples of collaboration. Captain Hicks of the British mission was attached to the Supreme Military Council, and once the move to Moscow had taken place, Trotsky formally asked the French military mission to cooperate in constructing a new army. By the end of March, 40 Allied officers were attached to the new army. Trotsky was also keen to keep in Russia the Czechoslovak Legion. Formed by the provisional government from Austro-Hungarian POWs of Czech and Slovak ethnicity, the Czechoslovak Legion had been stationed near Kiev when the armistice with the Germans was signed. When Colonel Muraviev captured Kiev, the Czech Legion, Muraviev's army, formed a temporary alliance and together harried the German army as it marched into Ukraine under the terms of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. At the Battle of Bakhmut on the 15th of March, the German advance was significantly delayed. The Battle of Bakhmut was one of the last battles on the Eastern Front in World War I, but between the Entente-backed Czechoslovak Legion, Soviet Russia, and the Central Powers occupying Ukraine after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The battle lasted from the 8th of March to March 13th, 1918, over the city of Bakhmut, today in Ukraine, and was the last engagement in World War I for the Soviets. Following a Legion victory, the Germans negotiated a truce. Once back in the Russian heartland, the Czechoslovak Legion announced it planned to leave Russia for the Western Front, but Trotsky could not see the advantage of keeping such a battle-hardened force at hand to fight alongside his newly constructed Russian army. To help persuade the Czechoslovak Legion to stay, On the 20th of March, he temporarily forbade any of their units proceeding further east towards Vladivostok. Trotsky was equally clear that his new army had to be a professional army. In a speech in a session of the Moscow Soviet on the 19th of March, immediately after his arrival in the city, Trotsky stated that a properly and refreshing... In a speech to a session of the Moscow Soviet on the 19th of March, immediately after his arrival in the city, Trotsky stated that a properly and freshly organized army meant using military specialists from the old army and imposing discipline. The message was repeated to a conference of the Moscow City Communist Party on the 28th of March, quote, "I have had occasion several times already to say at public meetings that in the sphere of command, of operations, of military actions, we place full responsibility upon military specialists and consequently give them the necessary powers." End quote. Trotsky also dismissed the principle of elected officers and soldiers' committees. Quote, "Given the present regime in the army, I say this here quite openly, the principle of election is politically purposeless and technically inexpedient, and it has been in practice abolished by decree." End quote. Trotsky. To the surprise of many, on the 30th of March, Trotsky appointed to the Supreme Military Council Admiral D.V. Verdurevsky, the Navy minister in Kerensky's last government. Wikipedia says Rear Admiral Dmitry Verdurevsky lived from 1873 to 1947 and was an Imperial Russian Navy officer who served as Minister of the Navy in the Russian Provisional Government in 1917. Back to the text. Footnote. Trotsky, How the Revolution Armed. For more on Trotsky's contacts with the Allies, see Swain, Origins of the Russian Civil War, isn't that what it said earlier? And footnote. By April 1918, Trotsky's discussions with Bruce Lockhart had reached the point where both sides envisaged a major British intervention at the moment when the, quote, breathing space with Germany was over. The British would persuade the Czech Legion to stay in Russia, where they would be reinforced by an Allied expeditionary force which would land in Archangel. Trotsky backed the scheme, but pointed out that Count Mirbach, the German ambassador, would arrive in Moscow on the 26th of April, making close relations between Trotsky and the Allies more problematic. Wikipedia says Wilhelm von Mirbach lived from 1871 to 1918 and was a German diplomat. He was assassinated while ambassador to Moscow. Back to the text. Yet even after the arrival of Mirbach, such contacts continued. They did so because on the 29th of April, the Germans revealed their true hand in Ukraine. Until then, the Germans had worked with a democratically elected government in Ukraine, but because of the commitment that government to land reform, the Germans decided to overthrow that government and establish a dictatorship. For many Bolsheviks, this revealed the true face of German imperialism, and on the 4th of May, Russian troops were instructed to resist any German violations of their new border. The Central Committee then went into a crisis session, which lasted the best part of the week, from the 6th to the 13th of May. Lockhart believed that a rupture with Germany was possible at any minute, but when Trotsky outlined to the Central Committee that he and Lockhart were proposing, Bruce Lockhart were proposing, Lenin spoke out against, quote, the English ultimatum, end quote. And despite winning the support of key members of the Central Committee, the scheme was dropped. Trotsky's eyes were still on Germany, however, and the threat it posed. the German army had steadily encroached on the initially agreed demarcation line between Russia and Ukraine. So they did so usually to take control of strategically important railway junctions. Cherkovo Station was captured by the Germans after some fighting on the 9th of May because they saw it as essential for communication with Rostov-on-Don, Bataisk, Bataisk railway junction was taken by the Germans on the 2nd of June. They justified their actions on the grounds that the Russians had not yet scuttled the Black Sea Fleet as agreed at Brest-Litovsk. While Lenin urged Trotsky not to overreact to such actions, Trotsky was less conciliatory. Quote, "It needs to be clearly and firmly stated that the truce and the demarcation line can only be observed on the condition of there being some minimum degree of trust on both sides, ... The artificially intermediate position created by the German command evokes extreme exasperation." End quote. Trotsky. Footnote. See J.M. Meyer, The Trotsky Papers, published in 1964. End footnote. It was because of incidents such as these that Trotsky and his military commanders were taken unawares by the SR uprising and mutiny of the Czechoslovak Legion, which occurred in the last week of May 1918 and the first week of June 1918, and started Russia's civil war. And the Left SR uprising was a rebellion against the Bolshevik Party by the Left Socialist Revolutionary Party in Moscow, Soviet Russia, on the 6th to 7th of July 1918. It was one of a number of left-wing uprisings against the Bolsheviks that took place during the Russian Civil War. The Left SRs had entered the Bolshevik government of Soviet Russia after the October Revolution of 1917, but resigned from the Council of People's Commissars in March 1918 in protest of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Left SRs continued to work in other organizations, notably the Cheka, while denouncing the treaty and policy of requisitioning grain from the peasants. After winning only a minority of seats in the 5th All-Russian Congress of Soviets on the 6th of July, the Left SRs assassinated Wilhelm von Mirbach, the German ambassador in Moscow, in the hope of recommencing the war against German imperialism and of igniting a popular uprising. The rebels occupied the Cheka headquarters and took its leader, Felix Dzerzhinsky, hostage, seized the telephone exchange and telegraph, and issued manifestos. Mikhail Muravyov, a Left SR and Red Army commander in the east, seized Simbirsk. After the uprising was suppressed with the help from the Latvian riflemen, the Bolsheviks arrested most of the party's leaders and expelled all of its members from the Soviets. Back to the text. And the revolt of the Czechoslovak Legion comprised the armed actions of the Czechoslovak Legion in the Russian Civil War against Bolshevik authorities beginning in May 1918 and persisting through evacuation of the Legion from Siberia to Europe in 1920. The revolt occurring in Volga, Ural, and Siberia regions along the Trans-Siberian Railway was a reaction to a threat initiated by the Bolsheviks, partly as a consequence of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. One major secondary consequence of victories by the Legion over the Bolsheviks was to catalyze anti-Bolshevik activity in Siberia, particularly of the Committee of Members of the Constituent Assembly, and to provide a major boost for the anti-Bolshevik or white forces, likely protracting the Russian Civil War. Back to the text. And that's the end of this section, this chapter. Thank you so much for listening.